Thousands of protesters took to the streets in Paris and across France Saturday in a direct rebuke of the far-right shift taking place in French politics. Rallies decrying the National Rally, or RN, the alt-right party, come ahead of upcoming elections in the French Parliament last Sunday. The surprise surge of the RN in the European Union Parliament, led by French President Emmanuel Macron, to dissolve the parliament and call for a snap election. Elections will be held next week.
The movement to the right, not exactly exclusive in France. In the last few years, a lot of Europe is going to the right, including anti-immigration and Eurosceptic parties surging in Germany. Alternative for Deutschland, or AfD, and Italy, the League or Lega, to name just a few of those parties gaining favor on those issues. Now, here to discuss this shift is investigative journalist Michael Shellenberger. Michael, great to see you again. Welcome back to Rising.
Great to be back.
So you wrote a really interesting piece for Public, for your Substack, about this trend, and you say that whatever one thinks about the policies or what the surging right-leaning parties want to do, the responsibility for getting to this point is really on the existing left-wing governments of Europe and other places that have allowed a lot of dissatisfaction to take hold. What do you mean by that?
Sure. Well, I was pointing in particular to policies around migration and energy, which really have been driven by the progressive left in Europe. And while, of course, as an outsider, you want to be sensitive to the differences in Europe and the United States, Robbie, what's so striking is how similar the political dynamics here in Europe are to the United States. It's an incredibly similar shift. You see migration being one of the biggest issues among voters, certainly after the economy and inflation, but recognizing that maybe there's less that the politicians can do about that or position other than use rhetoric. But certainly you see a very similar reaction. What gets called far right in Europe is very similar to what we would call the Trump or MAGA wing of the Republican Party in the United States, with the center right in Europe represented in what you might consider the never Trump Democrat or never Trump Republicans or the neoconservative Republicans. And you do see some differences, certainly in France, the left, the radical left or the far left, I guess, in contrast to the center left, is actually in second place. It shows how unpopular Macron is. Whereas in much of Europe, the left, including in Germany, including the Greens, lost significant support, whereas what's called the far right gained support. And this was after we saw a lot of, I think, pretty significant dirty tricks, including the use of intelligence and security agencies in Germany, France, Czech Republic, Poland, and probably other countries as well, arguing that they had evidence that the far right politicians had been taking money from the Russians without producing any evidence. It was quite a shocking case that we reported on. And maybe there is evidence, but they didn't present any. They didn't arrest anybody. There are certainly no prosecutions. They just introduced that a few weeks and they repeated it. And that appeared to have driven down the support of what's called the far right in Germany. But I do think that migration, when you speak to people on the streets, migration is a huge issue, just as it is in the United States, and reflecting of the numbers, which had been very large increases of migrants. And Europe, by all accounts, has done a poorer job of integrating, of assimilating immigrants than the United States. But yeah, I think as an American here, you're always struck by the differences, of course, between the United States and Europe. But it's hard to walk away from the last few weeks, that we've been here and looking at this and not get a sense that really we're a single global, media conversation and political conversation with a very similar dynamic here in Europe as in the United States.
We're seeing a rise in nationalism, especially across Europe, and that a lot of that's coming out of Russia, Belarus. I wonder, in your column, you talked about how the U.S. provoked Russia with the admission in NATO of additional NATO members. How do you square that with Russia going into Crimea, Russia taking Georgia?
Yeah, and I should say I have myself not taken a very strong position on this. It was really more to say I think that the political scientist John Mearsheimer has made the argument that NATO played a provocative role with Russia. It's certainly not a defense in any way of Russia's behavior, which is appalling. And I think that in terms of a political view, Europeans are unanimously against, Russia. They don't want to be under Russia's thumb. They don't want to, 90% of Europeans are opposed to Russia. But they also are very frustrated that they don't see an end to the war in sight. They feel like the war has been prolonged. It hasn't, there's not really a vision for ending it. And so I think that's also been a huge issue. The energy issue, of course, is, or maybe not, of course, but it is related to the Russia invasion, since they view the loss of the Nord Stream pipeline most people think here, due to NATO activities or some NATO countries, rather than Russia blowing up its own pipeline and that being responsible in large measure, along with the Green New Deal, which is the name of it in Europe, for higher energy prices. But I think that I also would say that I think most voters, including ones that voted for the so-called far right, consider themselves fairly moderate on these questions. There's not a strong desire to leave the European Union. The far right parties don't talk about leaving Europe. If anything, they just talk about, and they're not hard against any migration. They feel like the situation has gotten more extreme. So I think that's the argument that I wanted to make in the piece, was that I think voters felt that they were voting for moderation, for a recalibration. I think it's a mistake to think that the voters were voting for something far right. I think they were more reacting to what they saw as extreme migration, energy, and Ukraine war policies. They want to see moderation. I think there's a mood here for kind of getting back to normal still. They feel like they haven't really gotten back to normal after COVID and after the Ukraine war, and they're really desperate to do that and bring down prices, certainly the high priority. I would also say housing. You talk to young people, housing prices, lack of housing, affordable housing. It's like talking to people in California or Washington, D.C. or Boston or New York. It's a very similar set of concerns. So, again, I think it's a moderate electorate looking for moderate leaders. And you see, particularly in France, but really in all these countries, very strong efforts to moderate the message. France in particular has this very young, good-looking, charismatic 28-year-old who is in the far-right party, who has used TikTok very well, and it comes across very moderate, particularly compared to where that party has been positioned in the past.
Yeah, it's so interesting what gets described, by the media, by commentators as far-right, when it's like, well, is that really a far-right opinion, or has the government behavior shifted so far to the left that now that looks far-right, even when it's in keeping with what a majority of Europeans or Americans, like we see on the immigration issue, and I should say I'm in favor certainly of legal immigration. I want people to be able to come work in the country, help solve some of the problems you're just talking about. Housing. I mean, we need people to build houses. We need people to work in businesses. We need immigration. We don't want to suddenly have some kind of labor shortage, just like we wouldn't want a shortage of any other kind of resource. At the same time, I understand the frustration of people who live on the border of people streaming across in unsafe conditions and the kind of bureaucratic nightmare of vetting those people and deciding where they should be. So I absolutely understand people's frustration. We look to Congress, government, hopefully, to do something about the issue. But with a majority of Americans, so many Democrats saying, for instance, they trust Republicans or Trump so much more on immigration than Biden, and it's like, well, is that really? How can that be described as a far-right policy position when it's his most it's the one that it's the Republican policy position that is most popular in the country?
Yeah, that's right. And, it's interesting because it's a very similar dynamic. So, just today, I think we saw CNN did a report on how the black vote for Trump has increased from 7% to 21%. I think there's been some evidence that voters are less likely to buy into the accusations that Trump and MAGA and the Republican Party is racist. Very similar polling coming out of France and other countries, which also show a diminishing impact of accusations of racism or anti-Semitism. And of course, this occurring at the same time that the so-called far-right parties are attempting to moderate their position. But, just interviewing people on the streets, I'm in Ireland now, and we've been interviewing people about the proposed hate speech law, and I asked them if they feel like there is more hate speech, is there more anti-immigrant sentiment, and people say no, they don't think so. There's not a sense among ordinary folks that it's some huge hate speech crisis. But you did note there was a rally in France, a big protest in France against the far right party. So certainly the left is agitated, but it's a very similar dynamic in Europe as in the United States. It feels like the kind of very anxious, arguably hysterical reaction to MAGA and Trump nationalism has just diminished a bit. It feels like the fever has broken. It's obviously still there among folks on the left, but it feels like, people in the middle are less susceptible to those messages. And I think that means, one of the headlines that came out of the European elections was the center held. And while that's true, you did see a significant loss of support from the more radical far left in the elections than that suggested. So it does suggest that the center, as it governs, is going to be governing more as a center-right coalition at the European level, but arguably in the different countries than as a center-left coalition. But I mean, I got to tell you, what's so striking is just how unpopular these leaders are. Macron is unpopular. The Chancellor of Germany is unpopular. Obviously, or maybe not obviously, but the Prime Minister of the UK is very unpopular. So those pictures coming out of the G7 meeting a few days ago, that reaction you saw online, I think you see it in the streets too, is that people just have really lost confidence in the leaders. They don't feel like they have migration, energy, inflation, or just new housing where it needs to be, and they're looking for the pendulum to swing back to the center.
Michael Shellenberger, thank you so much for that analysis. We really appreciate you joining.
Great to be with you guys.